Hello, I'm Stephen Coates, and this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. And this is episode number 100. Can you imagine? I can't imagine. Back in the day when Adrian at Soho Radio asked us to make 4 programs, I think, about underground music in the Soviet Union, who would have thought that 4 years later, 96 programs later, still be here, still digging under the surface, still trying to get to the root, to the soul of this thing we call counterculture. It's been an education and a pleasure and a privilege. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But I thought, actually, for this episode, why not just dive straight in? Why not go on a trip? In fact, why not go on 10 trips? Because my guest for this episode, number 100, is Andy Mitchell, a neuropsychologist who took 10 different psychedelic drugs and wrote a book about it all. A wonderful panoramic, wildly entertaining and poetic investigation, I would say. We live in a time when psychedelics are making something of a comeback. Rarely a week goes by when you cannot read an article about a psilocybin test or an MDMA test, even a ketamine test at some university or hospital or another. We read about hedge funds, corporate investors trying to patent molecules. Big money, big pharma is lining up behind this psychedelic renaissance. And I don't know about you, whether you've had any psychedelic experiences or not, but there's something that I find uneasy about that. Have to be rather selfish to resist the possibility that the mental health crisis that we seem to be facing could not be addressed by this re-evaluation of psychedelics. Of course it's a great thing. At the same time, the involvement of the corporate, of the big pharma, scientists, is science the way to understand psychedelic experience? Are we leaving something out of the equation? What about fun? Well, when I read Andy Mitchell's book, 10 Trips, he helped me clarify some of my concerns about this thing, because I would describe Andy as a scientist, but also a poet, and a skeptic, and a journeyer. In this book, in this journey that he went on, he took 10 different drugs in 10 different settings, journeying from a neuroimaging lab in London to the Colombian Amazonian, via Silicon Valley and his friend's basement kitchen. He encountered scientists, gangsters, venture capitalists, con men, psychonauts, and shamans. And his experiences with the drugs themselves revealed the reality of psychedelics in all their richness, darkness, hilarity, wonder, and strangeness. But now, here is Andy Mitchell.
Nice to see you again, Andy. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Nice to be here, Stephen.
As we were just saying earlier, this is a book, it's also a personal odyssey, it's also an investigation of science, it's all sorts of things. But why don't you tell us the story, your story, how you came to write this?
With psychedelics, set and setting is always relevant, and my set all seemed to inform my experiences during the 2 months I was travelling around the world taking these different substances. Originally, I had a background in literature and then philosophy. I got really obsessed with poetry and the theories of what it is to be something. After a sort of detour via the film industry and then setting up an NGO for homeless people, mainly sort of crack and alcohol addicted men in the north of England, I ended up in a monastery in California for about 3 years, living a life of sort of solitude and meditation and study and in nature.
That jump from the film industry into setting up a facility for addicted men in the north of England, that's quite a shift.
Yeah, you've got me, Sherlock. When I say I was in the film industry, what I really mean is that I was sat in the pub drinking and taking quite a lot of Class A drugs and getting out of control, enjoying myself, and then realising that the joke had turned into something slightly more sinister, and that I was a little bit helpless. And so I needed to change my set and setting. I sort of come from a family of Welsh Methodist do-gooders. I decided that the antidote to my self-involvement and drug taking was to help others. So I got clean and sober in the sort of more traditional way of 12-step fellowships. But for me, it was really about a surfeit of energy and an interest in helping those people at the bottom of the ladder and finding meaning in the compassion of it. And that meaning awoke in me a spirituality, and it didn't have a kind of religious bent to it. But I did end up joining this rather bizarre Catholic Hindu monastery.
Catholic Hindu monastery?
Well, I mean, it was an Italian order of hermits. And I went to visit them in Italy, and it turned out that they had a huge interest in Hinduism.
Right.
And they had ashrams in southern India, which I've since been to. But I didn't speak any Italian, so it would have been a bit too of an isolating experience to be in the middle of an Italian hermitage. So they told me that they had an English language version of this in Big Sur, California, on a cliff top at the bottom of a mountain overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And there I went and met these wonderful, largely gay, non-practicing gay, bohemian types. And I, coming from the north of England, where we just look at our shoes if we're men and can't talk about our feelings, just sort of hugging things and being out in nature was just fantastic for me.
I'm from the north of England. Why don't you mean that? Let's just drop in that in terms of Big Sur, because Big Sur has got a legacy as well, hasn't it?
Totally.
In terms of the beats.
Totally. And
Dharma
Henry Miller, Kerouac.
Right. Yeah. So you've gone straight into a place with a heritage of seekers, poets.
A huge tradition of psychedelics during the 60s and the 70s is where McKenna ended up at the Esalen Institute lecturing to his beloved for 20 years. And the Esalen Institute was literally 5 miles up the road. Right. If I'd had enough of, monasticism, I would sneak out at night sometimes, and they've got these volcanic hot tubs overlooking the Pacific at Esalen where you're naked, and I would just keep my mouth shut and sit in the corner of the hot tub. After a couple of years of that, the monks were just tremendously well adapted and flexible, and they allowed me to do things that weren't typically monastic. So, for example, I went to LA and spent 3 months working with Mexican gang members who had just recently come out of prison, and I was with an organisation that were trying to get them to put down their arms, get along with each other, and do creative things. So that we set up a bakery and a graffiti removal thing, and then a fashion chain. They were designing their own clothes, and from there I went up to San Francisco, and I worked in a research program belonging to San Francisco University that was looking at how diaspora from Central and Southern America, young children coming to the Bay Area, having no money, stowing away, and getting work in the sex industry to support their families. And what was going back via them were sexually transmitted diseases that had never been seen in these parts of Southern America. And we were just looking at the epidemiology of that. And it kind of got me interested in science in general. I'd had very much a humanities background. So I decided to leave the monastery, and I began this rather lengthy training back in the UK in neuroscience, because I thought neuroscience at the time, it was the 90s, it was the decade of the brain. I thought about other options, but neuroscience just seemed to be a good way into being both intellectually satisfying and helping other people. And long story short, I eventually qualified as a neuropsychologist working in South London in a large hospital.
So just for anybody, and that includes me, who's not quite sure what neurosurgery are, just let us know.
I was involved in the diagnosis and rehabilitation of brain injury and brain disease. Mm-hmm. So typically it could be a traumatic brain injury from a road traffic accident, and if your brain is injured in that way, and then a surgeon saves your life and stops the bleeding, it's likely to change your life forever. Your personality and various different aspects of your thinking and feeling are going to be altered, and you're discharged from hospital. Maybe you can walk and maybe you're in great shape physically, but your brain is altered, and that just has a huge impact on the outcome for the rest of your life. So I was involved in rehabilitating brain injury as far as it's possible. I was also involved in diagnosing rare kinds of dementias. And I have to say, and maybe this says more about my shiftless character, but I became a little bit disappointed in the way that neuroscience understood aspects of being human, and the limited way that both neuroscience and the NHS, with its given very finite resources, was able to interact with people. So after a number of years, like a decade and a half, I applied for a sabbatical. I had this monastic background, and I became interested in how things like mindfulness meditation and yoga might be applied to neurological populations, that we might be able to help people, for example, with diagnoses of Parkinson's or MS, where the person after the diagnosis is likely to have 20 years perhaps of life, but will have great psychological adversity adapting to a progressive and neurodegenerative condition. And so off I went, first of all to India, and then to America, to making a number of retreats in different meditation traditions.
Were you there sort of as an academic, as it were, or practitioner, or both?
You got me again. I mean, each time you ask a question, you are spotting my prima facie defence, which is intellectualising my story, when in fact I was basically burnt out and I needed to go on retreat. But I managed to persuade my manager that a sabbatical in which I'd research applications of Eastern practices for Western health conditions, and it was very trendy at the time, so I got it. But as soon as I got there, I realised, crikes, 15 years of watching people suffer without a sense of really being able to help them as much as I'd initially hoped for when I set off on that journey to become a clinical neuropsychologist. I went on these meditation retreats. I did work at a hospital in Varanasi in India, in a children's neuro hospital. I went to another retreat in Central California towards the end of the year, and I bumped into a lady, an attractive lady, walked across the car park at Whole Foods, and I decided that I was going to put a note in her windscreen which said, I'm an English guy with a very attractive English accent, and I'll be in the area for a while. Doctor type, very, very well read, quite good fun. Love it. Fancy a cup of coffee. And so we went for a cup of coffee, and we were in this restaurant, again, quite near Big Sur, and she was very bright-eyed. In fact, she looked a little high. Now, remember, I'd not taken drugs for over 20 years or drunk. Before I got to asking her about the state of her pupils, she told me that she was microdosing. Thus started a conversation about psychedelics. This was the first time I talked about psychedelics in maybe 20 years.
What was she microdosing?
She was doing a mix of LSD and mushrooms.
But again, for anybody who doesn't know what microdosing is, it's taking a small enough amount of a psychedelic not to have a sort of noticeable effect on your behaviour, so either as a cognitive enhancer or possibly for therapeutic reasons or maybe for consciousness expansion reasons. But it's a small dose, right? So
it's
you're
a
not
small dose, and
technically tripping.
By definition, subperceptual, but almost everyone who microdoses that I've met takes way more than a subperceptual amount.
Well, you perceived that she was taking it.
I perceived that she was taking it, and then she said, look around the restaurant, probably half the restaurant. And we asked the next table, and they indeed had microdosed that day. I suddenly felt that I was in a part of the world where I was like the last psychedelic virgin, that everybody was at something, and it was cultural, and there were all these reasons that you just mentioned why you might take it, but it was also clearly faddish. Yeah. And I was quite dismissive of it.
Sure.
She started telling me about the neuroscience of psychedelics, and I'm a neuroscientist. You can't talk to me about that. And I put up these defences about it.
Because you say in the book as well that she turns out ayahuasca and also sort of pins you down a bit, doesn't she? Because
she does. She takes me to task for my ridiculous abstract defences of why people shouldn't take psychedelics. We have lunch and then we meet up a couple of days later, and the conversation kind of keeps going. Well, over the course of 3 or 4 weeks, I become persuaded by force of her argument and the integrity of her character. As you say, she's an ayahuasca. She's been serving ayahuasca in a Californian ayahuasca church for about 10 years. She's presided over hundreds of ceremonies. This isn't some crackpot. This is a lady that's sort of deeply imbued with indigenous lineages and traditions, and she's not reckless. 3 weeks later, I find myself with her in a temple in Santa Cruz in a forest, being administered the poison of a Sonoran toad, crystallized in a crack pipe and then vaporized, and instantly, philosophically, I do not exist. I mean, literally, my mind and body, as soon as the vapour touches my lungs, disappear. There's a dimension which is white, it's certain colours, there's certain prisms. It's terrifying. And then over the next 40 minutes, to the sound of crystal bowls and a vuvuzela and a guy with a giant headdress, I watched the layers of my personality reconfigure like the thin skins of an onion. I see how I am constructed. This drug, it's given me this astonishingly ineffable experience, and then it's given me the map of my character and my history, and I end up back at the birth canal of my mother, just about to start my life again. And for the next 3 weeks, that's how it felt. It felt like I was made of totally plastic neurons, that I might now decide which way the rest of life could go. And this newness had been brought into the world. I said earlier that I was slightly burnt out at this point. It turns out that this, without realising it, was exactly what I was looking for. Not immediately, but not long after. Publisher approached me about writing a book about psychedelics. Michael Pollan's book had come out in 2018, How to Change Your Mind, and had really reconfigured the psychedelic landscape by bringing people in the mainstream, people who were not narcotically inclined, not psychedelically inclined, to appreciate the kinds of benefits that science was now offering up about not just mental health for the sick, but for flourishing and well-being for the already well.
That's a good point to sort of jump in and link this, as we're going to do a bit later, back to countercultural years, because when psychedelics had sort of first blossomed, as Mike J says, it didn't start in the 60s, it went back to the 19th century, but there was this blossoming in the 60s. But of course, the flower that blossomed was quite quickly cut down. Well, all sorts of reasons, mainly a kind of social fear, I guess, from the establishment about, the massive impact it was having on young people. And there were obviously some very painful stories. But psychedelics were kind of closed down for years, really, weren't they? And it was really not until the 90s that, a few brave souls in a few places, I think in the States mainly, wasn't it? Or maybe in Holland or something, dared to sort of step out, start experimenting or start doing clinical tests. I mean, of course, people carried on taking psychedelics all the way through, right? But it went completely underground, didn't it? And really, I suppose, the context of this book and what we're going to talk about as well is that there has been this renaissance, right? And it's mainly in the area of mental health, in terms of its above ground manifestation, right?
I think that's the way it's been marketed, primarily, that we have now got, for the first time in 40 years, an alternative to antidepressant medication in the form of SSRIs, because certain psychedelic compounds appear to be able to treat a variety of different mental health conditions. And there's all ways of unpacking the science on that. The other thing to say is there's huge corporate investment in that narrative. There's another slightly lesser narrative, which again got a lot of corporate interest, which is more the microdosing story about how psychedelics can help well people, or particularly techie types, flourish and have cognitive enhancements. But they're the two narratives with which we associate the hype of the psychedelic renaissance. And Pollan's book was the kind of opening of the sluice gate on that hype about 5 years ago.
You'd have to be churlish to not welcome that stuff. Oft said that we're in a mental health crisis with young people, old people, across the culture. Not surprising given the sort of speed of things over the last sort of decades. So the fact that something's popped up at this time to deal with that doesn't seem coincidental, and it seems like a good thing. However, personally speaking, I had some undefined skepticism or concerns about it, and that was really coming from a kind of countercultural perspective, because one of the amazing things I thought about, what happened in the 60s was that there was a flourishing of music, fashion, art, poetry, theatre, ideas, ways of living, ways of loving. The counterculture, that's what we call it, right? And, partly it was propelled not just by social change at the time, but by psychedelics. And that side of psychedelics seems to have been left out a bit. The other thing which worried me slightly was this kind of corporatization of it, the way that sort of, hedge funds and big pharma are rushing in. I didn't quite know how to really understand what my concerns were until I read your book.
Right.
Because this book, it's very positive on that stuff. it is also somewhat sceptical about what's going on. In summary, psychedelics are bigger and more mysterious and more wonderful than all that stuff.
Let me just lead into that countercultural piece. I watched Peter Jackson's film about the Beatles, the 21 days in which the Beatles constructed Let It Be, the last album, when these four guys who basically couldn't stand the sight of each other were able to just sit in a room and crank out their last album, a brilliant album. And the film is so fantastic in that it pans around the streets of Soho as they're recording it, and we get possibly all these, for the last time in recorded history, we get this demographic of people from all ages and classes largely come into agreement that the Beatles are the best thing since sliced bread. The last time that the best music in the world was the most popular music in the world. And I remember that whilst I'm on a roundabout in a forest in Mexico, tripping my nuts off with my trip sitter, who's a very dark character. And I just find myself just in floods of tears about how psychedelics were banned pretty much the week after the Beatles put out Let It Be. And it's all been downhill since then. And I'm weeping that we've all gone to hell in a handcart and lost something. And I think what's important to say is, though, this isn't really a psychedelic renaissance for people that were taking drugs at that time, because there's been a great deal of psychonautical innovation and behaviour and cultural influence that's been happening throughout the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and into this millennium. As Eric Davis, the great psychonautical historian, talks about, this counterculture is a kind of spirituality of its own.
Totally.
And these people who took themselves to the brink and risked their sanity and pushed their boundaries in various ways in the name of creativity, for want of a better word, developed under the influence and via their psychedelic experiences certain kinds of fluidity and malleability and plasticity around how to handle themselves and how to encounter the world. And for me, that's kind of akin to sitting in a monastery and learning how to meditate and learning how to deal with fear and learning how to deal with lust and with one's intimate relation.
Our mutual friend Mike J, who's been on this show talking about psychonauts. Eric Davis also, right at the beginning of this show, joined us. And of course, what Mike research is in these psychonauts that go right the way back to the 19th century, people who were scientists, Humphrey Davy, for instance, huffing on ether, but they were also poets. There wasn't this division between science and the arts, or science and culture, right? And actually, when they were experimenting on themselves in the interests of both, and as Mike says, also could be quite good fun. Let's not leave fun out of the equation.
Let's not leave fun out of it. On that point, I mean, it's just a central irony that is noted in the book, that this psychedelic renaissance is based on disciplines not talking to each other. It's based on neuroscientists preaching about mental health. Neuroscientists who aren't interested anymore these days in poetry. Back when I was at St. George's, I was doing research into how medics make mistakes with diagnoses. I did kind of broad cultural intelligence tests, and you'd be just amazed how few people that have got 10 years of medical training know who Pablo Picasso is, or who Martin Luther King is. So there's something about the culture that's just become super duper specialised in a way that makes us suffer, that we can't integrate.
As you rediscover your love of poetry in the book is actually quite poetically written in places. You rediscover your love of Matthew Arnold and Wally Stevens. But when it comes to psychedelics specifically, it seems that division, to divide science, empiricism, from experience, from oral testimony, from immersion, seems bound to be defeated, because the actual substances themselves and the experiences themselves cannot be understood or shared or expressed by science alone.
Yeah, even the very act of science depends on having a stable subject that can get out of the way in order to study an object. But we know that with psychedelics, that you can't be a stable subject that's independent of the object. It all collapses. So psychedelics will kind of, because of this weird suggestibility, this weird pliability around set and setting will kind of give you what you want to see in some way, in some weird form.
Or what you need to see.
Or what you need to see, except that's just a mirage of, and something else is lurking underneath that. And as you say, there's something playful, and science's engagement with psychedelics kind of depends on deracinating and writing the play out of the experience, or making it all about a very narrow notion of what mental health is, for example.
We took a diversion there from your story. Let's return to the story, because that stuff is good context for what happens next. You do bring those things together, the immersive experience, the poetic aspect to it, your personal set. And for anybody who doesn't know, set and setting means...
And these are terms that were really coined by Timothy Leary in the 60s. Broadly, set is the state of mind that you bring, that the person brings, and their history to some extent. And the setting is the context in which the drug is consumed. And so in my book, I was the set in each time, and I had different attitudes towards different drugs, but I deliberately varied the settings. So I began in an fMRI unit at Imperial College London, taking a large dose through a drip in a brain scanner, and I ended up in South America with different shamanic lineages and curated different kinds of experience in between to try and illustrate the broad panoply of models around psychedelics, beginning with medical, going through spiritual, including that psychonautical tradition that was lost somewhat. And these models are all vying for the authority when it comes to speaking about psychedelics, and psychedelics undermine that authority. There's something about psychedelics in general that just defy being modelled.
Right. You go on this odyssey. One question that I've got for you is that it's in a quite a short period of time.
Yeah.
So another big issue surely has to be how these different psychedelic experiences, as well as the actual substances, interacted within you in the short period of time. Was that an issue ever?
When I think about the first experiences, this was like, almost after 25 years of being drug-free, there was a great deal of apprehension. The psychedelic space kind of does weird things with fear. You kind of learn to navigate fear in ways that are unprecedented in real life. But I found that I did awake this kraken inside me that just likes getting high. I mean, I shouldn't say that because it's not a responsible thing to do as a doctor, but I had to curate the experience in a very brief space of time because of COVID and deadlines with the book. And so I ended up having 40 nights of tripping in 60 days. And I took certain precautions. I was always careful about dosage. I never overdid it. I had a trip sitter who looked after me. I hired an integration therapist who I would Zoom in the days after each trip. By and large, I made sure that the setting was a safe one. The people that I was taking the experiences were people that had been either recommended or I'd been introduced to, and I felt comfortable around them. But maybe my standards for that are a little bit lower, a little bit more risky than other people's.
But also what becomes apparent, particularly as you further on you go, is that the setting aspect of it, the context, becomes almost as important as the substance, doesn't it?
Yeah. I end up in the northern part of Colombia. By this time, I've become quite philosophical about what psychedelics even means. It's a term that was coined in the 1950s just to mean manifesting the mind. What does that mean? We use psychedelics to unstick ourselves in different ways from our preoccupations with ourselves. But there's other cultures that don't need substances to do that. They're so radically different in the way that they relate to themselves and to their surroundings. And I found myself with the Kogi tribe, who are in the Sierra Nevada in northern Colombia, and they have such a sophisticated but bizarre cosmology. The priest class are trained from birth for the first 18 years in caves at 5,000 meters. They learn how to read their internal states and map them on to the night sky, which is visible through the windows of the cave. And so the sense of internal and external become totally blurred. And with that, this sense of time and past and present all become quite cyclical. And they think of some spirit called Mother or Earth as just stitching or threading the lives of every animate and inanimate object with each other from one moment to the next, and nothing is separate. And I had gone there not to take a psychedelic with these, but actually to receive a divination, a future forecast from one of the priests. So they use plants, but not traditionally psychedelic plants, although some of them are psychoactive. He used coca leaves and lime to alert himself to both me, who was standing in front of him by a mango grove in the mountains, and what impact I had both on his body and on the natural world. And by this sophisticated reading, or this kind of cartography of his environment, he spent 4 hours just working out what might be ahead of me.
It's an extraordinary passage, when you talk about this practice of paying back.
That's right, yeah. They believe that the mother is offering up the gift of relatedness at every moment. And to accept the gift is also to make a payment back to the mother.
Right.
And the payment can...
Ball of spit, or a little bit of
ball
fluff,
of spit, or from the fluff from your navel, or typically it can be gourd shells crushed and buried in the ground.
And when you describe it, it's just this extraordinary thing where he's connected and reading and experiencing the environment around you both in the context of you and him and what he's going to divine about you. It's like a sort of 4-dimensional tarot or something.
It's a 4-dimensional tarot, or it also reminds me of kind of quantum theory or quantum mechanics, where the scientist in a quantum field is really paying attention to how his observations are contributing to what he's seeing. Yeah. And that, to me, is like a psychedelic principle. It's not something that science does with psychedelics. We lock off the observation altogether. There's something inseparable about the seeing and the seen at all moments. And the Kogi are outrageously aware of that.
And how on earth would empiricism be a way of approaching or explaining that situation?
Absolutely.
It's not possible.
So I think in that sense, the psychedelic experience is perfectly plausible without psychedelic drugs. It's inherent in certain ways of being in the world. For me, that brought me back to my early conditioning, reading philosophy. I've really and poetry in particular. But poems are often just a conjugation of the poet in relation to the world around him, and how his attempts to classify break down or show up him rather than tell us something objective about the world outside of him.
Yeah, or you're communicating reality in a symbolic way. And as you experience it. Now, then what happens is that he makes, for all three of you, he makes a divination. Yeah. And in your case, he says, you're going to have another child.
He says, I'm going to have another child. Now, I've got 2 children who are in their late teens, and it's not been a cakewalk, and I'm quite glad that they're, on their way to adulthood. So to be told that I was going to have another child was largely a defeating proposition for me.
But did you take that literally or metaphorically?
I come to realise something that I've been carrying around that's been unborn in me for a long, long time. But I only realised that later. And it kind of makes sense rather psychedelically of the divination.
I mean, in some ways it makes sense of the entire thing.
I'll come to that in a second, but I want to, just going back to how somehow there's a psychedelic principle that's there in reality and is certainly alive in the Kogi culture. That really struck me at the very end of the book, when I just end up back in the Sierra Nevada with another shaman. And the shaman is from another tribe in the southern Putumayo part of Colombia, the Kamsat tribe. And he invites one of the Kogi to join a ceremony of a few of us. And it's in the mountains, and we're in a maloca. And I take a very small dose, but so I'm sufficiently sober to watch the Kogi throughout this ceremony. And they sit outside the temple, staring at the mountains where their homes are, which are in silhouette. They don't sing, they don't vomit. They're just impassively looking at the mountains. And afterwards, a Spanish-speaking friend goes and speaks to the Kogi about their experience. And they are just dismissive of it. They've taken large doses of ayahuasca and they're dismissive about it. And the reason why they're dismissive of it is they feel that it was distracting them from their relationship with the mountains. Which is where their home is. The implication being that relationship is already way too rich and meaningful and suggestive and doesn't need to be disrupted by this kind of intoxicated spree of misinformation.
Absolutely. So it's the curry pizza scenario. Sorry, that was a very unappetizing metaphor for the experience, but I think we know what you mean. But maybe it's a spoiler, actually, in a way, to talk about, the conclusions that you came to through that. Are you going to have a child? Are you not going to have a child? But it does lead to a realization.
Just to explain the context, try to keep as I have done in this conversation, part of the training of the scientist is just to keep one's psychology and biography out of it.
No need for that here.
I know, no need for it, but it's a kind of a standard reflex. And even in the book, I made other people's journeys centre stage for most of it. And in particular, I'd pick this trip sitter friend, a guy that I'd met in the Himalayas while I was on my sabbatical. And this guy had come from a very wealthy family in Florida. And at the age of about 12, he takes his first acid. It actually makes him feel more secure than he's ever felt.
Right.
Taking acid made him feel more secure. He got a job in Disneyland as a sort of 14-year-old. And when Disneyland shut for the evening, he and his friends would ride the roller coaster, tripping through the night. And it was his happy place. And he's gone on, really, for 3 decades to dedicate himself in one way or another to exploring psychonautical space, to put it politely. And one thing I like about him is that he's even when he's very, very under the influence, he's very level-headed and capable of making clear, good decisions. So I invited him from his base in Kathmandu to South America, and he was my trip sitter. And then, just by way of contrast, I invited another guy that I'd met in Istanbul. Not only had he never taken psychedelics, he'd never heard of psychedelics. He'd brought up in a rather orthodox Muslim house. He'd managed to keep fresh and virginal as far as psychedelic contamination was concerned.
So he's effectively your control.
He was my experimental control. So I had a trip sitter who was saturated with psychedelics, and then a control who was psychedelically naive, and I was somewhere in the middle. And the three of us, for the last part of the book, are on a journey together, largely through Central and South America. I come to see in them these very sort of powerfully understated but transformative experiences. But I think it's principally because of the engagements with other cultures rather than the actual nights that were spent tripping. And in the case of my trip sitter, for the first time in his life, he tells other human beings about what it was like to be a child in a broken home, and how he spent the most of his early years in a treehouse, lost in science fiction. And this was his defense against, difficult emotions. And then psychedelics came along and kind of held his hand for the next 3 decades. And as I said, he's someone, most people I've met are terrified at times of psychedelics. And for him, it's the happy place. Mm-hmm. And he, on the final night when we'd taken a psychedelic called Wachuma, which is a mescaline-based psychedelic from the San Pedro cactus, and we'd walked through the Andes Mountains with a shaman there. He had just broken down into floods and floods of tears, and it was the most heartfelt, the most human warmth. He's so prone to esoterica. On this night, he was speaking in a different voice with a directness that I'd never seen before. Meanwhile, my experimental control had just the most powerful experience of breaking free of a strict Muslim version of reality in which he would be marrying a Muslim woman and providing for his family and buying land and raising Muslim children. A psychedelic experience in which he'd turned into a giant condor and flown over the Andes, and he'd be a sort of very macho guy, very sort of patriarchal. He'd watched his own penis grow whilst very high and start heading towards this woman, and then the penis itself did this giant U-turn and started heading for his own mouth. And it's like the biggest fear in his life is that he's going to have to swallow his own penis, except it then detours and breaks in through his rib cage, and he spends about an hour making love to his own heart, and he suddenly realises that he's lost his inhibition. He doesn't need to be the person that he thought he was. This is his version of liberation. And so he comes out of the trip. This is pretty much his first ever psychedelic trip. He said, I'm gonna marry a non-Muslim, and I'm gonna buy a pet eagle, and I'm gonna buy a patch of land and turn it into a forest. He phones up his dad and says, Dad, I don't want to be a Muslim anymore, and I'm gonna buy you a new car. And he just makes all these kind of crazy,
It just sounds like he doesn't need to get married and he can make love to himself.
But he'd sort of bitten down hard on all the
he certainly
realizations of the trip, and then like about 2 weeks later he says, well, yeah, I'm not sure about buying my dad a car, and let's not mention the bit about my penis again.
Well, I think we've all been there. There's that moment, which I think, if you've been through experiences like this in any sort of way, we're probably familiar with. You get very, very close to people. And it's genuine, there is no doubt about it. And you make pacts even, that you're going to do things and stay together forever and you never forget this. And life isn't always like that. And that brings me on in a way to another big chunk of this, right? And another big chunk of...
I was just going to say, if you move on from that, you allow me to duck your earlier question about the unborn child.
Let's go.
I'm always looking to avoid self-revelation. And I think... just seeing this experience of these other two companions going through these profound experiences, I felt extremely jealous of them. Both of them were having these terribly moving, iconic moments. And where was mine? And I just became consumed that night by a deep jealousy.
Yeah.
That jealousy then turns into this doubt. There's a tendency to meet one's mother and father and birth and death over and over again in psychedelic space. And here I am, jealous. And then that jealousy turning into a kind of self-criticism about, I've just found an intellectual way of rationalising taking drugs for the last 2 months. And suddenly my internal voice is the voice of my father. Why are you always getting high? What are you running from? What are you avoiding? In that moment, I just remember that I only really became a neuroscientist because that was what my father thought was a respectable profession.
Right.
I've launched this book as a sort of an attack on the medical model for psychedelics, when it really part of it was an attack on my father for making me enter medicine. And this really was the unborn child that I'd been carrying around, is that personal evasion and of taking responsibility for my own life, that my life had been lived in reaction to my father rather than generating its own direction.
But is it an attack or is it a goodbye gift?
Yeah, there's a double bind there, for sure.
Because in a sense, how does one finish those relationships?
I think that's the other thing about psychedelics, is that which amplify what we're always doing all the time. We're turning something into a single story, like I just did, and then you pointed out the other side of the story. And psychedelics seem to just keep on saying, as soon as you've made a conclusion, as soon as you think you know what the insight is, it's also over here, tapping you on the shoulder. You're looking the wrong way. It really.
Or what about this as well?
Or what about this? Or don't take this too seriously. For example, you want to write this down in your journal and say, this is who I am. Well, wait until next week and see how that reads back.
Like your friend, who ended up making love to himself and
exactly
being absolutely certain about things to ring up his father, who must have been totally baffled by it.
Exactly.
And it's not that those things aren't real. The insight, and thanks by the way for telling us about the unborn child. And I suppose in a sense that experience, that realization, that insight about your relationship with your father, it's that needed to be given birth to. Is that what you...
I just carried it around without actually recognizing it, without being aware of it. It's a sort of metaphor, but it felt like a thought and a weight that hadn't been acknowledged and needed to be acknowledged. And in that moment it was. And funnily enough, in the sort of logic of psychedelic space, I went from realization, and I felt that realization physically because I died that moment. It's punctuated by this kind of physical eruption. And I literally felt my body and it was cold. And I smelt my body and it smelled... I've been around dying bodies. I smelt of death.
Right.
And of course, that was punctuated by a giant vomit. And then I felt fully integrated.
I'm glad to hear you talk about that, because that's the other thing, isn't it? Is that you can go through these experiences, you can feel deep, deep love for the people that you're with.
Yeah.
And an hour, 10 minutes, a day later, you can feel riven by envy and jealousy. And both of those things are sort of part of the experience, aren't they? And
Well, I'm glad you brought up that word envy, because it's particularly relevant in the Yahe tradition of Colombia. So if you take ayahuasca in San Diego in a church full of very beautiful people in nice white embroidered clothes, then what you're really doing is you're going to go through difficulty and end up in a giant hug, which you're all dying for, and you're just prepared to go to any lengths to get that hug. Come out of it saying things like, the universe is love, all is one. We all know variations of those kind of New Age mantras, and ayahuasca has been folded into the kind of New Age idiom of Californian way of being.
And I'm sure people realise this now, but there's gigantic ayahuasca tourism, hundreds of expensive retreat centres where you can go, and it's combined with macrobiotic food and yoga and
exactly.
Not necessarily criticism, but become a lifestyle.
Yeah, and it's certainly present, say, in a sort of commercial and touristic way in large parts of South America. But I had been sent by an anthropologist in Bogota to sit with a taita, which is the Colombian term for shaman, and to take Yahe in his house. And his house was on the outskirts of a small town in the Putumayo district, near the start of the Amazon. And this guy was a kind of town elder. It's a Catholic community, but on the outskirts of the town is this Kamsat tribe. And they're an indigenous tribe that were largely exterminated in the 19th century by Franciscan missionaries. But enough survived, and they've built up, and they've retained this Yahe tradition. That night, in his back garden, 20 people turned up at the door, each paying $2 each to sit and have this medicine, this drink with him. Their presentations were not mental health presentations. They often had like physical problems. There was a man with a club foot. There were 3 people with cancer. They sought him out. They would go to church and pray for well-being, and they would also drink ayahuasca. So there's this sort of fusion of the colonial practices of religion with the indigenous practices of the Yahe, the Kamsat version of Yahe. And it turns out that envy, the eliciting of envy, is the key mechanism in the Kamsat use of Yahe, that the taita wants to create what he calls an evil wind where everyone is envious of everyone else, and create this vortex of hatred for one another by which we break through to some kind of forgiveness. And it's very, very witchy. The whole ceremony is driven by this demonic-looking taita who's wearing a jaguar's head with giant teeth around his neck. This is not for tourists that he's doing this. This is happening every night. After he's finished his J job, he puts on the jaguar's head and the giant bird plumes, and he's whipping up this fury amongst the locals, and then they purge.
Right.
And purging in San Diego is something to be slightly ashamed of. I hope I don't get it on my beautiful white embroidered gown. And I realise I sound a little bit anthropologically naive here, but the purge is everything. That there's something that about this gastrointestinal intelligence that understands unprocessed, undigested history, the history of colonial murder, the history of bad families and bad genes, and the enteric nervous system, the so-called gastrointestinal nervous system, knows this in a deep way, and the Yahe will help cleanse it by purging.
Can't imagine envy being stirred up in one of those posh Costa Rican treat centres, although I'm sure it's there.
Yeah.
And that is, that's been certainly my experience. You may well, be at the end of the universe seeing that everything is connected, everything is one, or you may just be in a sort of horrible hole of green jealousy,
Right.
But
there's an interesting thing about the science there, because we don't really know how difficult experiences, bad trips, problematic, conflictual things, how they relate to outcomes in terms of long-term well-being.
Right, so that's it. So we tend to, understandably, because we like nice things and we don't like difficult things, we tend to judge that the good trip was the trip that was end of the universe, seeing that everything's connected. The bad trip was the one where you spent 3 hours kind of writhing around in your own shit, and in fact, but is that the case?
Well, when I think back on my experiences during those 2 months, I certainly remember aspects of glorious transcendence, but the ones that really stay with me viscerally are the moments where I was profoundly stuck and terrified.
Likewise.
And I think the reason why I remember those is that I actually got through them one way or another.
Right.
Over the course of my experiences, I developed certain skills, you might say, or certain dispositions which allowed me to tolerate fear and difficult experiences. And I would say that's been my main lesson learned for the year since I stopped taking psychedelics. The last year I've not really taken them. And I found a kind of, I'd say it's a mixture of resilience and imagination when it comes to being cornered by life that I didn't have before I took those psychedelics.
Right.
And I think that's something that the psychonauts have understood for a long time. Mike J, who you mentioned earlier, says that when he's been at the deathbed, as he has done, of several friends who've been involved with psychedelics since the 70s, that he's found a certain kind of just equanimity about their disposition, which he's not encountered when he's been with friends who haven't used psychedelics. And that makes a certain intuitive sense to me.
The skills, if you like, that one might develop in that situation is to be able to tolerate some fear, some horror.
Yeah.
Because that fear, that horror is teaching you something.
Can almost make the further step and say it teaches you axiomatically that the thing that you're trying to protect in that fear is something called a self, which is different from things outside of it.
Right.
And those kind of definitions just lose hold in psychedelic spaces. And neuroscience backs this up. It's really too hard when you're tripping balls to have an integrated sense of self as being separate from the things it thinks about, from the things outside of it.
That brings us full circle, really. The sort of final thing I wanted to talk about with you, Andy, was integration, right? There's this thing which I've noticed amongst my psychonautic friends as well, which I think is quite important. You can have the most profound experiences, which are genuine, but you have to integrate them in your, let's put this, non-psychedelic life.
As an arch skeptic, even integration feels to me to be part of the corporate vocabulary. There's a sort of commonplace that you need an intention before you go in order to contain the experience. Then you need integration to recontain the experience and translate it into something useful in the aftermath of the experience.
I partly mean that, yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, but really what I meant was in terms of, say, these things being packaged up into discrete treatments, which the NHS at some point may deal out. When you're integrating or trying to integrate it in someone's life, there's all sorts of other things which might be going on in their lives. Poverty.
I see what you're saying.
Social conditions, environment that they've got to go back to. However wonderful the psychedelic space can be, you still have to come home. You're still there, you know.
I mean, as you say, I've worked in severe and enduring mental health units where things like poverty, early sexual and physical trauma, or possibly other genetic factors are the key determinants of that person's ongoing mental health problems. And the idea that some 4-hour experience, however transcendental, might change those material circumstances, it just can't be true. That points up to a certain kind of superficiality about our fetishizing of experiences, and psychedelics plays into that we can have an experience that is to some extent gonna guarantee us that our lives will never be the same again. Just doesn't hold water for me. I mean, what does hold water is that rich and strange and unprecedented things can happen, but unless they're translated into mundane, concrete ways of navigating the world, they'll remain as experiences only, in the way that kind of gold figures adorn an altar. You might, for example, have felt this huge kinship with nature and that you're never going to let go of that new eco-awareness. But the research shows that for all those experiences, people do not change their behaviour around their environments. Yeah. And I think that happens in all sorts of subtle ways with psychedelics. They're insightful, but are they actually changing behaviours in a long-term way? And possibly they are, but unless the individual makes it a real cause to change that, then it won't happen.
My sort of final pitch to you as well, which is going to come back to culture, I suppose, because it seems that if, along with the renaissance in treating mental health issues, there was a countercultural renaissance connected with psychedelics where it starts to impact the culture in terms of the arts and ideas about living and loving like it did in the 60s, that in itself would have a therapeutic, let's call it that, or a fun therapeutic consciousness expansion effect on our societies. And that actually then the use of psychedelics as medicine for mental health has got a bigger context, and the actual substances themselves are back into the culture rather than in the lab or in the silver packet in the medicine cabinet. That there's an amazing future ahead. I'm sort of sounding a little bit like the Age of Aquarius here, but it's like that if it's in the culture too, not just in medicine, then in fact actually it could be transformatory in the way that it once could, but that had to stop for whatever reasons in the 70s. Is that possible?
Yeah, I think I'm sceptical of that. I mean, I agree in principle that these things can have amazingly transformative effects on the cultural and creative imagination. But I think that we haven't really moved on since things were banned in terms of 1970, in terms of the way we regard pleasure and where pleasure sits in the psyche and how it might relate to medicine and mental health. My fear, and I think it's the fear of many, is that as soon as the arguments that are made persuasively, like you just did, about a broadening out, then there'll be a reactionary movement that's quick to repoliticize psychedelics
to stamp
in the way
down
that
on
it was.
Yeah. Well, it's a big threat to the establishment. They remain that because it changes people's minds, changes people's hearts. We can become more independent thinking. We can become less observant of traditional values. That's what happened in the 60s. That's what could happen again.
The thing to say with this is that there are definite risks inherent to psychedelics, and it's part of taking psychedelics is negotiating that risk.
We live in a society which is trying to eliminate risk, which is strange. Economics like to say, without risk, there's no reward. Just to sort of go right back into your experience, say, with the Kogo trial.
Yeah.
What really struck me about that part of the book was that it's about their environment, their context. It's not about bad or good. Or when you talk about them stirring up envy, and you look at the context of these South American tribes or ethnic groups that use psychedelics, it's not like they've become wonderful utopias. They're still full of the human condition with difficult things and poverty, and so all this stuff is going on. So maybe we also need to unhook ourselves from the notion that one of the duties of psychedelics is to make us better people.
I agree.
Right? And maybe actually it's in the way that, when one focuses on dreams or on the unconscious, it has an effect on us which makes us more human rather than better. And we can detach ourselves from this Western idea of progress.
I totally agree. And I think a narrative in the book which I still hold is that psychedelics awaken you to what's already interesting in an unintoxicated way. And you can, with a disposition and a way of looking and a certain type of curiosity, you can find richness in all sorts of different ways without needing to, although you might choose to, resort to huffing plants and animal venom.
Andy Mitchell, thanks for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thanks for having me. A pleasure.
Thanks to Andy. What a story. What a trip. What 10 trips. I really recommend his book, 10 Trips, The New Reality of Psychedelics. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's got some deep science in it, it's got some deep thinking in it, but it's poetic, it's a wild ride, it's an adventure, it's a great read. And as we brought up, it's also fun at times and thought-provoking. As you might be able to tell, I've got some skin in the game on this subject. I feel that these programmes should be about three things. First of all, the story. Secondly, the interviewee. And thirdly, of course, the audience. Not really about me. I did get a bit more involved this time, and I hope not too much. I was quite excited by the conversation. Psychedelics have had a transformatory effect in my life. I don't preach their use. One has to be extremely careful about them, I think. Approach them with caution. That's appropriate. So then definitely not for everybody, and obviously not for everybody at all times. But from my first experiences into more recent times, I can say that even though some of the experiences have been very difficult, very dark, I've benefited immensely. And I've benefited immensely from the Bureau of Lost Culture, which of course is a psychedelic experience in a different way. I was hoping to make more of the episode 100, but as you may be able to tell from my voice, I'm a bit ill at the moment, so I'm going to save that for number 101 and to talk about all the amazing responses that people have made and suggestions via our questionnaire. Thank you for that. Thank you for listening. Thanks to Adrian, Rachel and Esmeralda at Soho, all my guests over this century of programmes. Maybe there'll be another century or two to come. I hope so. Just feel like I'm getting warmed up, starting to learn and understand things a bit better. In the meantime, I shall see and hear you, I hope, down the road and round the bend for the next episode of Bureau of Lost Culture. And we'll be unearthing more stories from the counterculture, more oral testimonies from the underground.